Welcome to the Dark Chronicle. Tell us in the comments which country you're watching from and the time of day it is for you. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell to catch every chilling tale. In the humid, suffocating summers of the late 1850s, there were stories whispered so quietly that even the crickets seemed to pause just to listen. They began not with a scream or a gunshot, but with a strange, chilling silence. A silence that settled over plantations like a shroud, making even the bravest overseers keep their hands closer to their pistols and their horses closer to the barn doors at night. The origin of the tale is impossible to trace. Some say it started in Georgia, others swear it came from the muddy banks of the Mississippi Delta. What all versions agreed on, however, was this: a nameless slave was moving through the South like a storm, silent, unseen, unstoppable, and killing white men with a precision that didn't belong to any ordinary man. People called him many names: the Shadow, the Black Reaper, the Devil's Bastard, the Man with No Chains. But none of those names were ever spoken loudly, not out of respect, out of fear. Plantation owners would lower their voices when even mentioning him. Overseers would jerk their eyes toward the tree line as though the man could appear at any moment. Slave patrolmen, usually proud and ruthless, began refusing to work alone. The legend did not begin with one story. It began with dozens: a dead overseer here, a vanished patrol there, a plantation burned to nothing but ash and bones. At first, white men didn't believe it. They dismissed the stories as superstition among enslaved people, folk tales invented to inspire rebellion or courage. But slowly the bodies piled up, and the killings had a pattern, a method, that suggested something far more terrifying than coincidence. Word spread like wildfire. One man, one shadow, one ghost in flesh, a slave who eliminated more men than some Civil War regiments, but who never left behind a name, a motive, or a single surviving witness who could describe his face. Rumors on the plantations. For the enslaved, the legend grew into hope. It started with a whisper by the river. Two field hands in Georgia quietly speaking while pretending to wash tools. One told the other, "He came from the woods, tall as a tree, fast as a storm, didn't say a word, but he freed 7 men that night." Then the story changed. In Alabama the tale became, "He was once chained, they cut him, starved him, tried to break him, but he killed them instead, all of them." And in South Carolina, "He ain't no man, he a spirit sent by God." To enslaved people, the idea of a man out there, one of them, fighting back against the impossible world they were trapped in, it was intoxicating, dangerous, forbidden. But they whispered anyway, whispered in cabins, in fields, under the watch of men who would whip them for speaking hope. Yet something about the legend spread too well, too fast, too consistently to be just rumor. Even the masters noticed the fear in their slaves' eyes had changed. It wasn't submission anymore, it was expectation. Something was coming, something they didn't dare describe. The fear among the masters. Plantation owners across the South held emergency meetings. In Louisiana, a group of wealthy planters met in a mansion outside Baton Rouge, with thick drapes pulled over every window. They shared stories, each worse than the last, stories that made them drink whiskey faster than they ever had. Patrol Captain Harlan Tate recounted one. "We found 6 men dead in the woods near Carter Field, throats cut, no guns fired, no struggle, no tracks. Dogs refused to go further. It weren't a group, it was one man." Another man, sweating through his fine cotton shirt, interrupted, "Nonsense, a slave can't do all that." But even he didn't seem convinced. Then came the testimony of a Louisiana overseer whose hands shook as he spoke. He was the only survive. Or of an attack on a neighboring plantation. "I heard footsteps," he said. "Fast, too fast, like he was already behind me when I turned. My lantern blew out. I heard men scream, then nothing. When I lit the flame again, every one of 'em was gone." "Gone?" one planter repeated. "Gone how?" "No bodies," the overseer whispered, "just blood and the smell of the swamp." The room fell silent, stories of an impossible man. The killings didn't follow a pattern, yet they did. Every strike seemed random, yet it also felt intentional. Each plantation hit had a reputation for being particularly brutal, abusive, or ruthless. The worst places were always the first to fall. Word traveled of a slave who moved like the darkness itself. One plantation mistress in Georgia reported that her dogs refused to leave their kennels for days after an attack. Another man claimed the killer could jump a creek wider than a wagon. A third swore he watched the man climb the side of a burning barn without any support. People said he didn't breathe loudly, he didn't speak, he didn't hesitate. Every killing was swift, precise, personal. The burned plantation. The story that finally cemented the legend came from the Hollow Creek plantation, the same place where the first reported massacre took place. At dawn, smoke rose from the horizon like a funeral column. By the time patrols arrived, the plantation house was only a skeleton of charred beams and collapsing walls. The smell of blood was thick enough to taste. They expected to find slaves unchained, escaped, scattered into the woods. Instead, they found the enslaved workforce kneeling in the field at sunrise, silent, motionless, and terrified. The white men, however, 23 of them, lay dead near the house. Their bodies had not been burned. Each appeared to have been killed before the fire started. A single blow for each man, some with broken necks, some with crushed skulls, some with deep, precise cuts. But one detail broke every expectation. There were no footprints, not around the bodies, not around the house, not even near the slaves. The soil should have recorded everything. But the ground was strangely untouched, as though a ghost had passed through, as though the killer floated. Only one slave dared speak, and he said only, "He came and went like wind." The overseer struck the man hard across the face, but he said nothing else. The weapon no one saw. Rumors about the weapon circulated widely, too. Some said it was a machete, some swore it was 2 blades, others believed he carried no weapon at all, that he used only his bare hands. The strangest claim came from a patrol leader who found strange markings on the bodies. They weren't cut with a knife, he said, but not with claws neither. Something sharp, curved, too clean to be improvised. He looked at the sheriff and added, "This weren't done by a slave. This were done by someone who knows what he's doing." A silence followed that no one had the courage to break. The growing panic. Newspapers avoided the topic. They didn't want to stir fear or encourage rebellion. But missing patrolmen could not be hidden. Dead overseers left behind widows. Burned plantations could not be explained away. The story no longer belonged to whispers. It became an epidemic of fear. Some planters started sleeping with rifles under their pillows. Others hired more overseers, built watchtowers, and organized larger patrols. But none of it worked. Every attempt to stop him only made the legend grow. Some families fled their plantations entirely. Houses were abandoned. Cotton fields were left unpicked for the first time in decades. One Alabama owner left a letter behind before fleeing. "I have 300 slaves and 70 rifles, yet I am helpless against a single shadow." The question that haunts the South. As the months passed and the killings spread across state lines, one question clung to the tongue of every terrified man. In the South, who is he? No wanted posters existed because no one knew his face. No bounty was issued because no one could describe him. No patrol could track him because he left no trail. Some said he wasn't a slave at all, maybe a free man from the North trained in combat. Others insisted he was a runaway who had tasted blood once and now thirsted for vengeance. A few whispered that he had help, a secret network of slaves guiding him through forests, feeding him, hiding him. But the most chilling theory of all frequently leaked through the hushed conversations of enslaved people. He died once. They killed him, but he got back up. Masters scoffed at that idea, but only in public. In private, no one dared deny the possibility, because the man they feared, the shadow that haunted them, never made a mistake, and no ordinary man could kill 250 people and simply disappear without a trace. The legend takes shape. By the end of that year, the legend was complete. Every fire, every missing patrol, every strange sound in the night became attributed to him. Children were told stories so they wouldn't wander into the woods after dark. Slave patrols refused to take routes that passed near swamps. Even the tough, whiskey-soaked hunters, who prided themselves on their fearlessness, lowered their voices. When speaking of him, the whisper became a certainty, the rumor became a truth, the shadow became a man who defied the impossible, a man who killed 250 white men, a man who left no trace, a man who was never ever seen again. A ghost, a curse, a reckoning. The South had no name for him, so they called him whatever their fear allowed, but the enslaved people had another name for him, one they spoke only in darkness, only when hope was needed most, the one who cannot be caught. And thus the legend of the impossible slave began. The flames reached so high into the sky that even people miles away could see them. The Hollow Creek plantation, once one of the most feared and disciplined estates in Georgia, burned like a beacon of wrath. The air tasted of smoke and charred wood, and the ground trembled beneath the distant roar of collapsing beams. The night animals had fallen silent, and even the wind refused to blow. Something about the fire felt wrong, as if nature itself didn't want to touch it. By the time the first patrol arrived, the fire was dying down. Thick plumes of black smoke drifted over the field like mourning veils. The men who rode in were hardened patrol officers, men who had beaten, hunted, and chased slaves for years without flinching. But the moment they stepped off their horses, something tightened in their throats, a feeling they couldn't name. Something colder than fear. The plantation was too quiet. Even a burned estate should have had noise. Crackling wood, animals panicking, survivors shouting. But Hollow Creek was silent, utterly and suffocatingly silent, as if the land itself had been stunned. The first body was found near the front steps of the mansion. Patrol Captain Harlan Tate crouched beside it, wiping soot from his eyes. The corpse lay twisted, the neck broken so violently that the head seemed to stare behind itself. His pistol was still holstered. Tate touched the man's face and felt that the skin was still warm. He didn't even get a chance to scream, a patrolman murmured. As the men moved farther into the ruins, the scale of what had happened slowly revealed itself. Bodies lay scattered in odd, deliberate positions, some on their backs with their chests caved in, others collapsed face down with crushing blows to the spine. Many had no visible weapon wounds, only trauma inflicted by force no ordinary man could deliver. One overseer had his arm twisted backward until the bone split through the skin. Another had been thrown against a stone pillar so hard that his ribcage collapsed inward. "Lord above," someone whispered, "ain't no slave could do this." But the men didn't say it loudly. None of them wanted to provoke the possibility that the shadow from the rumors had finally shown his face. As they moved deeper into the courtyard, they found blood smeared in streaks across the tiles. Not random streaks, drag marks. But the bodies weren't dragged far. It seemed whoever killed them pulled the corpses only a few feet, then left them arranged in strange, haunting formations, like warnings, like messages. One man's throat was cut so precisely it looked almost surgical. Another had deep punctures in his chest, too clean for claws, too uneven for knives. It was as if the killer used something curved, sharp, foreign. A weapon no one recognized, or perhaps no weapon at all, just strength beyond reason. "Spread out," Tate ordered, though his voice cracked with uncertainty. "Look for survivors." But there were no survivors among the white men. The deeper they went, the more bizarre the scene became. The fire had eaten much of the house, but the bodies near the outer courtyard were untouched by flames. They had been killed before the fire was set. Some were found with their eyes still open, frozen in terror. Others had arms raised, as if trying to shield themselves from something that struck too fast to see. The youngest patrolman, a boy barely 19, approached the next body and immediately doubled over, vomiting in the grass. The corpse's jaw was shattered, hanging loose by threads. His right leg was bent at an unnatural angle, the bone sticking through the skin, and on his back, carved into the flesh with chilling precision, was a single symbol, two intersecting lines, forming something like a crooked X, not drawn with a knife, but gouged, as if by fingers. "What kind of monster does that?" The boy choked. No one answered him. Near the slave cabins, the soil was disturbed just enough to suggest a struggle, but no tracks remained. No footprints, no drag marks, nothing. The earth looked almost smoothed over, as though nature itself erased the evidence. When Tate knelt to inspect the dirt, he found it slightly warm, like someone had been there minutes earlier. Suddenly, one of the patrolmen shouted for the others to come. They followed his voice around the side of the burned mansion toward the well. There, lying in a perfect circle around the stone well, were 7 bodies. Each had a deep slash across the throat, the cuts identical in length and angle, as though performed by a methodical hand. Their blood pooled into the dirt, forming dark, sticky puddles. But what made the men step back in horror wasn't the bodies. It was the fact that every man's eyes had been closed. Not by accident. They had been carefully, intentionally closed after death. A burial gesture, a ritual, or a warning. "This ain't human," the patrolman muttered. This ain't normal." Tate swallowed. "Look for the slaves. They must have run." But when they reached the field, something even stranger awaited them. Every enslaved person on the plantation, men, women, children, was kneeling in rows, kneeling in perfect, unnatural silence, their heads bowed, their hands pressed together in front of them as if in prayer. None of them looked injured, none of them were chained, and none of them moved when the patrol approached. "Stand up!" Tate yelled. Nobody moved. He stepped forward and grabbed a man by the shoulder, shaking him. "What the hell happened here? What did you see?" The slave lifted his head slowly, and his eyes carried a terror so deep it seemed to echo inside the soul of anyone who looked at him. Tate had seen beaten men, broken men, starved men, but he had never seen fear like this. It was the fear of someone who felt they were standing in the presence of something not entirely human. "He came," the man whispered. Tate stiffened. "Who came?" The slave's voice cracked as he spoke, as if the memory itself wounded him. The one from the woods." The patrolman exchanged nerve glances. "He moved like smoke," the slave said. "We heard nothing, not his feet, not his breath, but men began falling like their souls were snatched." Another slave, an older woman, lifted her head. Tears streaked through the soot on her face. "He ain't one of us," she whispered. "He ain't from this world." The youngest patrolman stepped back. "This is madness," but the old woman shook her head. "You can whip us, chain us, starve us, but you can't lie to us. We know what we saw. The man who came, he ain't like other men." "Did he free you?" Tate asked, voice low. The woman's gaze hardened. "If he wanted freedom, he would have taken all of us. He didn't come to free. He came to punish." A ripple of unease moved through the patrol. One of the older slaves raised a trembling hand and pointed toward the woods. "He left through there." The direction made Tate's heart sink. The woods were too dense, too dark, too endless. Anyone who entered could circle for days and never emerge. But before anyone could take a step, a sudden gust of cold wind swept through the field. It blew so sharply that the torches flickered. The horses whinnied and pulled against their reins, and just for an instant, everyone heard it. A faint sound coming from the tree line, not footsteps, not breathing, something more like a whisper, a low, barely audible hiss of movement, as if something massive and fast had glided through the underbrush without disturbing a single leaf. Every patrolman raised his rifle. Tate drew his pistol, but nothing emerged. The forest stared back at them, dark and silent and impossibly deep. One patrolman wiped his face with a shaking hand. "We're being watched." Tate didn't respond. He felt it too, the prickle along his spine, the cold block of dread in his stomach. Someone was out there. Someone who had slaughtered 23 grown men in minutes, someone who had vanished without tracks, without noise, without witnesses, someone the slaves spoke of with a kind of reverence, someone the patrol feared with a kind of primal terror, the shadow, the reaper, the nameless slave who killed without mercy. And as the darkness thickened around them, as the last embers of the plantation faded into glowing ash, Tate understood one thing. This was not the work of a man running for freedom. This was the work of a man on a mission. And whatever that mission was, it had only just begun. In the days following the Hollow Creek massacre, the South did not sleep. Plantation owners doubled their watchmen. Patrols were reinforced with men who had once fought in distant wars, and every whisper carried the same uneasy tremor. Something had risen out of the swamps, something with hands strong enough to break bone, with movements fast enough to evade every trap, with a mind sharp enough to stay invisible even while leaving behind a trail of dead men. Yet the killings didn't stop, they spread. At first people thought Hollow Creek was an isolated rebellion, a freak incident, a fluke. But within a week another plantation, Eagle Bend in Alabama, reported its overseer missing. His horse came back drenched in sweat, saddle broken, as if it had bolted in terror. Men searched the woods for 2 days before finding the overseer's body wedged into a hollow tree trunk, not placed, forced. His ribs were snapped inward, and the tree's bark was torn as if something had shoved him inside with monstrous strength. There were no tracks, no weapon left behind, no signs of struggle beyond the mangled corpse. The patrol captain who found him vomited into the leaves. 2 nights later, the far more fortified Pike Ridge plantation in Mississippi went silent. Lanterns were still burning in the windows when patrols arrived. Livestock was still locked in their pens. The front gate was still latched, but the men, every overseer, every guard, even the plantation foreman, were dead. Some were found lying face down in the dirt, skulls cracked open. end by a single blow. Others were found with deep gashes across their throats, clean as if made by a blade yet jagged at the edges. One overseer was found tied to a tree with his own belt, head slumped forward, neck broken so suddenly he had not even fallen sideways. A patrol officer walked the ground shaking so badly he had to brace himself against a wall. "This ain't no rebellion, rebellion's allowed." The man beside him nodded slowly. "This is a hunter." Word of that expression spread quickly. A hunter. It echoed through fields, cabins, saloons, and dining halls. It was the only explanation that felt right. The killings were too clean, too controlled, too deliberate. A rebellion was chaos. This was art. Slave owners began carrying rifles to bed. Wives begged their husbands to leave the plantations. Some men took their families to the cities, abandoning their fields and investments because no amount of money was worth what Hollow Creek had suffered. Meanwhile, for the enslaved people, something else was happening. Something subtle, dangerous, hopeful. The servants who swept floors in the big houses or cooked in hot kitchens overheard their masters speak in frightened tones. Patrolmen would whisper at windows while cleaning weapons. Overseers would drink themselves numb in barns, muttering about the shadow man. Slaves heard everything, and word traveled through the quarters like wildfire. A few described the killings with fear, others with awe, some with gratitude, but in every voice was the same unmistakable certainty he was real. The man who came out of the trees, the one who moved without sound, the one who passed through patrols like they were smoke. It didn't take long before slaves began to cooperate with the unseen destroyer, not boldly, not in ways that would raise suspicion. Their help took the form of little things: a cabin door left slightly open, a single mark carved into a fence post, a bowl of food placed beneath a cypress root, a bucket of water set deep in the woods behind a barn. A whispered warning passed from one plantation to another: "He's near. Hide your children. Stay indoors tonight. Patrol's coming. Send the signal." It was an underground network born not out of planning but out of fear, curiosity, and a desperate hope that someone, anyone, was finally fighting back. The shadow, the reaper, the nameless slave, whatever he was, he wandered through their lives like a myth brought into flesh. Everywhere he struck, he vanished without taking a single slave with him. That confused the masters most. They expected an uprising. They prepared for it. But no uprising came. Not a single runaway. Not a mass escape, not a riot, just death, only death, and that made him more terrifying than all the rebellions combined. In Georgia, an entire slave patrol went missing after tracking footprints into the Blackwater Marsh. They found the first boot sunk in mud near the water, then the second, then a rifle snapped in half. The bodies were scattered through the marsh, half submerged, faces twisted in terror. No cuts, no blows, no strangulation marks. They had drowned in water barely knee-deep, all of them. Just kneeling water. Men who hunted slaves for sport. Men who bragged about killing with their bare hands. All drowned. The only clue was a long streak of dragged mud leading toward the tree line, then abruptly stopping as if the killer had lifted the last victim straight into the air. A patrolman stared at the end of the trail, mouth dry. "No man can do this." The sheriff beside him whispered, "Maybe that's the point." The killings became more frequent. They were never sloppy, never rushed. Always exact, always careful, always purposeful. One night, the Maddox plantation in Louisiana erected massive fences around its boundaries, posted armed guards every 20 feet, and kept lanterns burning until dawn. Every overseer was awake, every dog loose, every guard armed, they deaf, elt protected, safe, ready. But the killer didn't come from the outside. He came from within. The guards on the north fence saw something first, movement, a flicker of shadow. They called to each other, shouted into the dark. Then their shouts turned to screams. When dawn came, the plantation owner awoke to find every guard on the north fence dead, not slashed or shot, dead from broken necks, all snapped with the same clean, precise twist. Worse, the killer had crossed the entire yard, moved through the cabins, and vanished again. A handful of slaves claimed they'd seen nothing. Others said they'd heard something like the wind hissing, but faster. But one elderly man, trembling so violently he could barely speak, whispered, "He walked right past me, I know he did, but I ain't see him. All I saw was the dark movin'." The owner slapped him so hard the man's lips split. "You're lying! No man can walk through a crowd unseen." But the old man only whispered again, "He ain't no man." The killings didn't just unsettle the white world, they shattered its confidence. Slave patrols stopped working alone. Dogs refused to enter certain woods. Horses would panic at the sight of shadows. Even seasoned overseers, men who once whipped slaves without blinking, would not approach a cabin or barnyard at night without 3 lanterns and 2 rifles beside them. Every night felt heavier, every wind carried whispers, every cracking branch echoed like footsteps. The South breathed in fear and breathed out rumors. As for the killer, he seemed to grow bolder with every strike. He attacked caravans transporting slaves, not to free them, he never freed any, but to destroy the men who guarded them. One caravan was found overturned, horses dead, wagons smashed, but the slaves untouched. The guards, however, were found hanging from the trees by their belts, stripped of their weapons, their bodies left facing the direction of the rising sun, as if someone had arranged them for display. The governor of Georgia wrote to the governor of Alabama, "We are dealing with a threat unlike anything we have known. He does not liberate slaves. He does not announce his intentions. He is not fueled by chaos. He is strategic, calculated. He chooses the cruelest plantations and leaves others alone. We do not know what he wants, only that he wants someone specific, and he is working his way toward them." That idea terrified them more than the killings. A single man with a target, a single man able to walk across the South undetected, a single man that every slave protected even without seeing him. It created cracks in the social order that no owner wanted to acknowledge. Meanwhile, enslaved people began leaving markings everywhere, symbols carved into trees, stones turned a certain way, ashes arranged in patterns, tiny signs that meant nothing to the overseers but carried meaning among the slaves. "He's close. He passed through. Danger. Safe." What terrified overseers most was that every cabin, every field, every stretch of forest now felt connected by an invisible web of communication they could not decipher. The slaves were no longer just laborers. They were eyes, ears, messengers, allies to the one man they feared. On a cold night in late autumn, Patrol Captain Harlan Tate, who had seen Hollow Creek with his own eyes, sat at the edge of his bunk polishing his pistol. He hadn't slept. His hands trembled, his mouth was dry, his nerves were frayed from chasing a ghost. He heard tapping on the window. He froze. Tap, 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 slow, purposeful, rhythmic. He lifted his lantern and approached the window, heart pounding. His breath fogged the glass. The tapping stopped. He stared into the dark. Nothing. No footsteps receding. No shadows moving. No figure running. Just the darkness watching him back. He turned to call for the other guards. But when he opened his mouth, he felt cold metal press under his chin. Not a knife. Not a gun. Something curved, something he did not recognize. A whisper brushed his ear, low, steady, calm. "You're at Hollow Creek." Tate's knees buckled. A gasp escaped him. He didn't dare turn, didn't dare breathe, didn't dare look death in the face. The voice, if it was human at all, continued, "Run." The pressure vanished. Tate spun around. The room was empty. The window was unlocked, and he knew with a clarity that nearly stopped his heart that running would not save him, because Hollow Creek was not the beginning. It was only the first chapter. The hunter was moving through the South, carving his message into bone and fire. And what terrified Tate more than the killings, more than the bodies, more than the silence, was the growing certainty that the shadow wasn't hunting overseers at random. He was hunting someone specific, and he was getting closer. The moment the riders thundered through the pine brake, leaving shredded branches and hoof-gouged earth behind, the forest did not fall silent. It held its breath. The scent of churned soil and sweat lingered long after the posse vanished back toward the settlement. David stayed crouched in the hollow beneath the fallen oak, every muscle locked so tightly he felt carved from the very roots around him. Only when the last echo dissolved did he finally allow his lungs to drag in air. Night was coming. Fast, he rose carefully, every sense sharp, the burn of exhaustion dragging at his limbs. Hours earlier he had escaped the cabin massacre by nothing more than reflex and instinct, instinct honed over brutal years and sharpened into something endlessly watchful. But the cost of that miracle was already revealing itself. They knew he was alive, and they knew he was close. Men like Tobias Redding and his hired hunters did not give up. They tracked for sport, for pride, for reputation, for the sick pleasure of dragging a runaway back in chains or a corpse. Either would do. Yet David also knew something else. Those men's certainty would be their downfall. He had spent his entire life listening to their orders, studying their rhythms, learning the way they thought danger moved. They tracked in straight lines. They expected fear to scatter a man like frightened game. They assumed a runaway always fled south toward the swamplands or north toward the hills. They never imagined he understood the forest better than any of them. They never imagined he would move toward danger instead of away from it. He followed the river upstream, his steps featherlight over rotting leaves and tangled roots. The moon broke through cloud cover just enough to paint the water in ripples of silver. He kept to the shadows, hand brushing occasionally along the rough bark of cypress trunks, reacquainting himself with the land he had spent years studying when they believed he was too broken to think. But every hidden ridge, every shallow pool, every animal trail was etched into him. The forest was not an obstacle, it was an ally. Half a mile upstream, he reached the old hunter's blind he had helped build years ago under orders. The structure had collapsed, long overrun by vines, but its frame remained. It was a place he could study the terrain and listen without fear of being easily seen. As he settled into the grass, his mind drifted to the events that had set everything in motion. The cabin, the conflagration, the accusation, the screams of the woman who had tried to shield him, and the gunshot that ended her life. He had run, but not to escape. He had run to survive long enough to ensure her death meant something. But the men who blamed him did not understand what they had created. They believed they were hunting a fugitive slave. They had not yet realized they were hunting a man who had spent years quietly preparing for the moment he could turn every cruelty they inflicted into precision, into strategy, into purpose. He stayed in the blind until the moon had fully risen, and then continued his trek deeper into the woods. A chill wind threaded through the branches, whispering warnings and carrying distant voices. Not human voices, natural ones. The groan of a shifting tree, the distant call of a night bird, the crack of something moving through underbrush. Those sounds mattered more than anything the hunters shouted to one another. Animals never lied. When an owl shrieked, sharp and sudden, David froze. The bird did not sound threatened, it sounded annoyed, startled by something heavy moving below its perch, something that did not belong. He waited. Seconds stretched into a full minute. Then the faint scuff of boots slid across leaf litter somewhere to his left. They were closer than he thought. He slid backward behind a cluster of thick shrubs, slowing his breath. Through the weaving leaves, torchlight flickered. 3 men, spread wide, taking careful steps. They weren't yelling now. They were too close for noise. These were the cautious ones, the ones who had lived long enough to be careful. David stayed low, calculating distances, routes, possibilities. He could not risk confrontation yet, it was too soon. The forest gave him shelter, but only if he respected it. Silence was his greatest weapon right now. The men paused near the riverbank. One knelt and pressed his fingers into the muddy ground. A tracker. David recognized him, the wiry man with the fox-like eyes who had once boasted he could trail a raindrop through a storm. David had always suspected the man exaggerated his skills. Tonight he prayed the bragging was true, because the prince the man followed would lead him nowhere. David had doubled back 3 separate times, stepping onto stones, climbing trees, and wading through shallow water to confuse the trail. And when he left Prince, he left them intentionally, pointing in a direction he never intended to travel. The tracker rose, frustrated, muttering curses. The men moved on. David exhaled slowly, relief washing through him. He was still ahead, but not by much. He waited until their torchlight vanished entirely, then crept out from the bushes. The forest opened into a wide stretch of marshland ahead, a place thick with tall reeds and deep pools that could swallow a man in silence, perfect for disappearing, but not where he wanted to end up. Not yet. He had places to reach before dawn. By the time the first light of morning crept across the horizon, he had crossed the marsh, climbed a steep ridge, and descended into a valley that smelled of smoke. His jaw tightened. Smoke meant habitation. Habitation meant risk, but it also meant opportunity. He moved along the ridge carefully, until he reached a vantage point with a clear view of the valley. Below lay an old logging camp, long abandoned and half destroyed by storms. Only one building still stood, the storage shed reinforced with iron braces and a stone chimney. Thin tendrils of smoke curled from the chimney's mouth. Someone had claimed it. David remained still, watching. A man emerged, stretching stiffly, rifle slung over his shoulder. Not one of Redding's hunters. David knew all their faces. This man was a stranger, grizzled, middle-aged, with a limp that altered his stride. A drifter, perhaps dangerous, perhaps not. But David needed supplies, a blade, maybe flint, maybe anything that could be turned into a weapon. The posse had numbers. He had only intelligence, patience, and resourcefulness. Supplies could tilt the balance. He shadowed the man from a distance as the stranger walked to the nearby stream. When the man bent to fill a bucket, David stepped from behind a boulder, keeping his hands visible, empty. The man spun, startled, gripping the rifle. David raised his voice, steady but quiet. "I'm not here to harm you." The man studied him with weary suspicion. "Then you picked a hell of a way to say hello." David remained still. He couldn't reveal who he was or the danger trailing him, not until he understood the man's temper. Meant, but he could offer something else. "Hunters are riding these woods," David said. "Men who shoot first and talk later, they're heading this way." The man's grip on the rifle tightened. "You being hunted?" "Yes." "That trouble got anything to do with me?" "Not unless you want it to." A beat passed. Two men, strangers, both measuring risk. The forest around them rustled with birds but remained otherwise still. Eventually the man sighed and jerked his head toward the shed. "Come on, but don't try anything stupid." David followed. Inside, the shed was dim but warmer than the cold morning air. Supplies lined the far wall, old axes, a rusted saw, scraps of leather, coils of rope. David's pulse quickened. Not weapons exactly, but materials, tools he could shape into something lethal. The man poured water into a kettle and set it over the fire. "Name's Harlan. Been living out here alone for 7 years, you?" David hesitated, then spoke the truth but not the whole truth. "David," Harlan nodded slowly, looking him over. "You ain't dressed like a free man." David's throat tightened. "I'm a hunted man, doesn't make me a wrong man." Harlan studied him with a depth that surprised David, a depth that felt unsettlingly perceptive. "I ain't in the business of judging strangers," Harlan muttered, "but I can see in your eyes you're running from more than people. Looks like you're running from what they'll do if they catch you." David said nothing. "You're welcome to rest here," Harlan continued, "but if that posse rides through, I won't let 'em burn this place down. I wouldn't ask you to." "Good," Harlan sat heavily, "because tomorrow you move on." David nodded. He didn't intend to stay that long anyway. He only needed a few hours, a few tools, a few decisions. When Harlan stepped outside to gather firewood, David rose and moved to the tools, running his fingers over them, choosing carefully. The rope, the leather straps, the sharpenable handle of a broken axe, pieces that could be reshaped. He wasn't planning an escape anymore, he was planning a war. And when the first heavy bootsteps echoed faintly somewhere in the distant trees, too many footsteps to be hunters simply passing by, David knew his war was already beginning. Harlan re-entered the shed, eyes narrowed. "You hear that?" David nodded, every muscle coiling with resolve. "They're coming. Then what exactly do you plan to do, son?" David picked up the broken axe handle and turned it in his hand, feeling its weight, imagining what it could become. "Whatever it takes to make sure they regret finding me." Under the dim haze of early dusk, the sound of distant voices grew louder, clearer, and more organized. David and Harlan crouched low near the cracked window of the old shed, watching the tree line as shadows stretched long across the valley. The footsteps were no longer vague suggestions carried on the wind. They were closing in, and judging from the cadence, the spacing, the way the noise swelled and retreated like a living thing, it wasn't just a handful of men. It was a hunt. Harlan's expression hardened as realization settled on his shoulders like a weight he'd carried before. His grip tightened around the rifle, but his eyes flickered sideways at David. "You bring a whole damn storm with you, don't you?" he muttered. David didn't look away from the tree line. "I didn't choose it, but I'll end it before sunrise." The older man exhaled through his nose, a mix of resignation and acceptance. "You plan on living long enough to see sunrise?" David reached for the pieces he had collected earlier. The rope coiled neatly, the axe handle sanded smooth, the leather straps cut precisely. "I plan on making sure they don't," he answered. The men in the forest paused, their torches flickering like floating embers as they regrouped. David's instincts sharpened. They were being cautious now, moving with deliberation. That meant they had discovered something. Maybe the footprint he had left on purpose. Maybe the discarded branch he had stepped on, the one that snapped loudly enough to echo in the quiet. Clues that nudged them closer, inch by inch. Harlan stood and gestured sharply. "We can't sit in here waiting for them to surround the place. We need height, the roofline, the ridge, somewhere we can see 'em coming before they see us." David agreed. If they were boxed in, the men would burn the shed or storm it. Either way, it would be over quickly and badly. They slipped out the back entrance, moving toward the slope that climbed up behind the abandoned logging camp. The ground was steep but familiar to David now. Every root, every loose stone, every patch of brittle earth. Harlan moved slower due to his limp, so David supported him without a word. They climbed until they reached a cluster of boulders overlooking the entire valley. From here, David's breath caught, not from exertion but from what he saw. More torches than he expected. Perhaps 20 men, maybe more. Their formation wasn't random, it was practiced, like men who had tracked for years. Scanned the ground carefully, spreading into a semicircle, and at the very center of that group stood Tobias Redding, the man responsible for so much suffering, the man who had sent hunters into forests, swamps, mountains in pursuit of escaped enslaved people, the man whose cruelty had driven David to prepare, to wait, to plan. Redding raised his torch, illuminating his sharp, calculating face. He was giving orders, harsh ones. A man beside him nodded and began directing groups toward the ridge, toward the stream, toward the shed. David felt something inside him shift, something quiet, something still, like a blade settling into its sheath. "They're closing the circle," David murmured. Harlan spat. "They'll flush us out like rabbits." David watched the men spread, calculating. "Not if we strike first." The older man looked at him, brow furrowed. "There's 2 of us and 20 of them." David shook his head. "There won't be 20 by the time they reach this ridge." He opened his hand, revealing a small pouch he had crafted from leather scraps. Inside were sharp fragments he had carved from the broken saw blades, tiny jagged pieces that glittered faintly, even in the failing light. Harlan's eyebrows rose. "What in hell is that?" "Insurance," David said quietly. "And a message." They worked quickly. At the narrowest point in the uphill trail, the place where the ridge funneled into a single-file choke point, David and Harlan laid the traps. Thin threads of rope stretched low, nearly invisible, tied between saplings. Beneath them, David sprinkled the metal shards he had sharpened. Unstable ground, limited visibility, forced movement. Perfect. When the traps were set, they retreated further upslope, hiding behind the boulders. David crafted a sling using leather and the axe handle, his hands steady despite the tension twisting through his chest. Harlan loaded the rifle and lay down prone, finding a stable firing angle. The first hunters appeared on the trail minutes later. 3 men, shoulders broad and steps heavy, their torches bobbing like fireflies. They spoke confidently, too confidently. They believed they were chasing a cornered man with no allies, no weapons, and nowhere left to go. Their arrogance became their undoing. The lead man's boot caught the rope. He stumbled forward, crashing chest first into the metal shards below. He screamed, falling hard, torch flying from his hand and rolling off the path. The 2 behind him halted, startled, but too late. As they crouched to help him, they sank into the same trap, slicing their palms and shins. Blood dotted the ground in rapid, bright drops. Harlan took aim. A single shot cracked across the valley. The second hunter dropped instantly, dead before he hit the ground. The gunshot ignited chaos. Shouts erupted from the forest as the rest of the posse scrambled to pinpoint the source. Torches swung violently as men rushed toward the ridge from multiple angles. More were coming. David sprang into motion, using the sling to hurl a stone with brutal force. It struck a man at the base of the trail in the temple. He collapsed, twitching, while 2 others dove behind trees. Harlan fired again, hitting another hunter in the chest. The echo of the shot bounced through the valley like thunder. David didn't hesitate. He slid down the opposite side of the ridge, silent as shadow circling wide. The hunters were disorganized now, their formation fractured by panic. Some shouted orders while others shouted questions or curses. He saw an opening. 2 hunters moved down the slope alone, searching for a flanking route. David trailed them quietly, stepping where they stepped, blending with the darkness until he was close enough to hear their breath. When one paused to relight his torch, David struck, his arm looping the rope around the man's neck, jerking it backwards with ruthless precision. The man fell without sound. The second turned, startled, but David was already moving. He slammed the axe handle into the man's ribs, then into his jaw, dropping him instantly. He dragged both into the shadows, removing their torches and scattering them down the ravine to confuse the others. From the ridge, another gunshot rang out. A miss. Harlan swore loudly. His position was exposed now. David sprinted back upslope, weaving through brush as bullets whined past leaves and bark. He crested the ridge just in time to see two hunters rushing Harlan from behind. David shouted a warning and launched a stone at the first man, striking him in the shoulder, but not stopping him completely. The second tackled Harlan, slamming him into the ground. The rifle clattered away into the underbrush. David charged, rage burning through every muscle. He swung the axe handle with full force into the attacker's skull. The sound was sickening, but the danger did not end there. The first man rose, knife drawn, eyes gleaming with murderous intent. David barely dodged the first slash. The hunter lunged again. David caught his arm, twisted hard, and drove his knee into the man's gut. The hunter stumbled, wheezing. David pushed the advantage. He grabbed the man's wrist, wrenched it backward until bone cracked, then swept his legs. The man fell, screaming, but David silenced him with a final strike. Silence returned, heavy and cold. Harlan groaned, rolling to his back. "You're fast," he muttered, voice shaky. David offered his arm and helped him sit. "You're alive, that's all that matters." But even as he said it, he knew this was far from over. Below them, torches were regrouping. The men were furious now, less cautious, more determined, and at their head, Tobias Redding lifted his lantern and pointed directly toward the ridge. "They know where we are," Harlan whispered. David nodded, heart steady, mind calm. "Good." "Good?" Harlan hissed. David picked up the rope again, tightening his grip as his eyes locked onto Redding's silhouette. "This is the moment I've been preparing for," he said softly. "Tonight Tobias Redding learns he should never have come looking for me." And as the hunters began their final ascent, David stood tall, ready to turn the forest into the graveyard Redding had never expected. The torches below flickered like angry fireflies, gathering force as the last remnants of daylight bled out of the sky. David crouched at the ridge with Harlan beside him, both men catching their breath in the few precious seconds before the final wave of hunters surged upward. The forest felt tense, alive, but not neutral. It held memories of every footstep, every whispered order, every gunshot, and now it held the promise of what was coming. Harlan wiped blood from his lip, his limbs trembling with pain and exhaustion. "They're charging up the trail," he muttered, "and this time they know exactly where to aim." David didn't respond right away. His eyes were scanning the terrain, mapping every rock, every shadow, every choke point the hunters would have to pass through. Everything about this ridge favored someone who understood patience, and David had patience carved into his bones. He finally answered, voice steady, "Then we don't stay here." Harlan's eyebrows shot up. "Where the hell else are we supposed to go?" David pointed to the slope behind them, a treacherous, jagged descent into a dense patch of old-growth forest, a place where the ground dipped suddenly, forming natural ravines, hidden pits, and sudden drop-offs. A place that could swallow a man whole if he didn't know the land. Harlan stared at it, incredulous. "You want to climb down that death trap in the dark?" "Yes," David said simply, "because they won't expect us to." "And when they follow?" Harlan pressed. "They won't follow the way I go." A thunderous crack split the air, a gunshot from below. Bark exploded near the boulder where Harlan had taken his last shot. David grabbed him by the arm. "Move," he whispered. They scrambled toward the downward slope, sliding between jagged stones and thick roots. David moved first, guiding every step so Harlan wouldn't misplace his footing. The descent was slow at first, but gunfire forced them to pick up speed. Bullets tore through leaves. A torch arced through the air over their heads and landed somewhere below with a dull thud. The hunters were getting desperate, but desperation made them sloppy. David reached the bottom of the slope and inhaled deeply. The old-growth forest stretched before them, its underbelly a labyrinth of twisted bark and shadows. The air was thick with the damp smell of moss and decay. Perfect. Harlan caught up, wheezing. "Now what?" David knelt and pressed his palm against the ground, feeling the soil. He found what he needed almost instantly, a patch of earth softer than the rest, a sinkhole, shallow but unstable. Now, he said, we give them a reason to fear the ground they walk on. He moved quickly, using his hands to disturb the edges of the sinkhole, widening the soft earth until it formed a hidden trap roughly 6 feet across. Harlan watched warily. You're making the ground collapse? He asked. David nodded. Under the weight of anyone running. Harlan's face twisted with understanding. You've done this before. Prepared for it, David corrected. Voices echoed down the slope, shouts, curses, the frantic crackle of brush being trampled. The hunters were coming fast, so David grabbed Harlan's shirt and pulled him behind a large fallen tree. They ducked, breath held, as the first wave of men tore into the forest. The trap did its work instantly. The leading hunter's boot sank into soft soil. He barely had time to scream before the earth gave way beneath him. He plunged waist-deep into the sinkhole, arms flailing. Another man crashed into him from behind, and both tumbled deeper, landing with a sickening crunch on roots and buried stone. Chaos erupted. Men scrambled, torches waving wildly, shadows dancing violently across the trees. Some tried to pull the trapped hunters free, only to lose their balance and fall in themselves. David watched silently, eyes unblinking. This is only the beginning, he whispered. Harlan glanced at him uneasily. How many of them you actually plan to kill tonight? David didn't answer immediately. The question wasn't simple. It wasn't about numbers. It was about purpose. As many as I have to, he said finally. Enough that the rest start running instead of hunting. Enough that Redding feels what I felt when he came for me. Even as he spoke, more hunters pushed past the chaos at the sinkhole, their torches now fewer but angrier looking. These were the ones who wouldn't hesitate, the ones who wanted blood more than justice. David moved before they fully entered the clearing. He stepped silently toward a cluster of young pines where the branches grew low and narrow. He unwrapped a length of rope he'd tied earlier. One end looped into a noose, the other anchored high up the trunk. He'd set it hours ago, before Harlan even offered him shelter. As the next hunter sprinted through the trees, the rope whipped tight around his ankle. He was yanked into the air, flipping upside down before he could scream. His rifle clattered to the ground and fired randomly, sending sparks into dead leaves. The man spun, suspended, shouting for help, but the hunters behind him hesitated, spooked. This ain't normal tracking, one yelled. This is a setup. David stepped forward, his voice cold and calm. You're right. The man dangling upside down twisted, seeing David's silhouette in the torchlight. His eyes widened in terror. Please wait. But David wasn't listening to pleas. Not from men who dragged screaming people across miles of forest without mercy. Not from men who laughed when bodies fell. He swung the axe handle upward. One clean strike silenced the man forever. The hunters behind him froze, fear choking their shouts. Some backed away, some raised their guns, some pointed toward David as if naming a monster in the dark might make him less real. There, one yelled. It's him. He's right. David ducked as gunfire shattered the air, bullets slicing through bark inches above his head. He rolled left, grabbed the fallen hunter's rifle, and fired 3 rapid shots into the brush. 2 hunters dropped instantly. The third shrieked and stumbled backward into a tree. Harlan fired from behind the fallen log, dropping another. But the fight wasn't over. Not even close. More voices echoed from deeper in the forest. Reinforcements. Men Redding must have held in reserve. Their torches bobbed toward the clearing, growing brighter, closer, more numerous. David felt his pulse settle, not quicken. This was the moment he had been preparing for. Everything before this had been thinning the herd, fracturing their lines, making them scattered and afraid. Now the real confrontation was coming. Redding's voice boomed from behind the new wave of hunters. Fan out, don't let him vanish again. He's somewhere in these trees. David felt something cold and sharp settle inside him. Tobias Redding was close, close enough that David could track the rhythm of his voice, the cadence of his orders, the arrogance it carried. Harlan grabbed David's arm. We can't hold them all off. We need to run. No, David said softly. Running is what they expect. Then what do you want to do? David adjusted his grip on the rifle, shoulders straightening. I want Redding to walk into the one place I know better than anyone. And where's that? David pointed toward the darkest stretch of the forest, the place where the trees grew so tightly clustered that no torchlight could break through. Into my shadow, Harlan swallowed hard. You're leading them. Exactly. And when Redding follows? David finally looked at him, eyes burning with a quiet, unstoppable fire. When Redding follows, he whispered, he won't walk back out. And as the hunters poured into the forest like a flood of torchlit fury, David slipped deeper into the darkness, already 3 steps ahead, already guiding them toward the ambush he had waited his whole life to use. The deeper David moved into the ancient forest, the more the world around him changed. The air grew heavier, thick with the smell of damp soil and old secrets buried beneath layers of moss and fallen leaves. The canopy above swallowed nearly all traces of moonlight, leaving the path ahead illuminated only by faint, shifting glimmers that threaded through branches like dying embers. This was not the part of the woods where hunters ventured willingly. It was the part they whispered about, where the land twisted, where echoes wandered, where people disappeared without leaving footprints. David had spent years studying this place in silence, walking its hidden trails when others slept. He knew where the ground dipped sharply, where roots coiled like traps waiting to catch careless boots, where the sound of running water disguised the direction of footsteps. He had not stumbled into this forest tonight. He had led Redding here intentionally. Now the forest itself felt as if it watched him. Behind him the hunters surged, clumsy and loud. They cracked branches, cursed at shadows, tripped over roots, and shouted Redding's name as if invoking him would offer protection. But their torches were their undoing, tiny moving suns revealing every mistake they made, and every mistake David used. Harlan followed close, breath ragged. He was trying to keep pace, but the uneven ground and constant dread made him stumble more than once. David slowed just enough to keep him close. "You sure this is smart?" Harlan hissed, gripping his ribs. "They're closing in." "It's only smart if we get far enough," David whispered back. "Far enough for what?" David didn't answer. Not yet. They reached a fallen cedar, massive and twisted, its roots jutting from the earth like a skeletal hand. David slipped beneath the curved trunk, passing into a narrow corridor between 2 boulders. Harlan hesitated. "You sure this ain't a dead end?" David crouched and pressed a hand against the stone. It was slick with moss but cool. The air beyond the stones wasn't stagnant. There was an exit. "It's no dead end," he said. "It's the only way forward." They pushed through the gap, emerging into a hollowed basin beneath interlocking branches. The soft earth muffled their steps. Here the forest held its breath. Even the hunters' distant shouts grew dull, as though the trees absorbed sound. Harlan looked around uneasily. "Place gives me chills. It gives everyone chills." David adjusted his grip on the rifle. "That's why they won't move through here in a straight line. They'll slow down, start second-guessing every step." "Buying us time?" David glanced back at the narrow passage they had just slipped through. A passage too narrow for more than one man at a time. "No," he said, "giving me the bottleneck I need." A torch flared on the other side. The hunters had reached the cedar. Their voices echoed as they tried to force their way through the narrow rocks all at once. David raised the rifle. Harlan grabbed his arm. "You shoot now, they'll swarm us." David's eyes hardened. "I'm not shooting to kill. I'm shooting to scatter." He fired one shot. The bullet struck the torch instead of a man. Fire splintered into sparks that rained across the hunters, igniting panic. Men cursed and stumbled backward. Someone dropped another torch, and it went out in the leaves. Chaos erupted again, but David wasn't trying to kill them here. He was pushing them forward into the deeper, darker parts of the woods, where torches became useless, where fear replaced courage. He turned to Harlan. "We're moving." They descended into the basin until they reached the heart of the old forest, a place few people had ever seen. The trees here were ancient, their trunks scarred with storms and age. Deep pits opened like wounds in the earth, covered by layers of leaves that made them almost invisible. In the center of the clearing stood a dead oak, its branches twisting upward like a giant skeletal crown. Harlan's voice dropped to a whisper. "You led us into the devil's mouth." David didn't deny it. "I needed the exact place where the land does half the fighting." He crouched beside the roots of the dead oak and brushed aside leaves, revealing a coiled vine rope anchored to a stone spike he had driven into the ground years ago. Harlan stared. "You been setting traps here all this time?" "I didn't know when I'd need them," David said quietly, "but I knew someday I would." The first hunters reached the basin edge. Their voices trembled. Their torches barely pierced the suffocating darkness. David motioned to Harlan. "Stay behind the oak. Use the shadow. Fire only if they get too close." "And you?" Harlan asked. David rose. "I'll draw them in." He stepped into the clearing, his silhouette just visible enough to be mistaken for a shadow until someone pointed. "There, I saw him. He's ahead!" Redding's voice roared into the night. "Spread out, catch him now." But spreading out was exactly what David wanted. The first hunter rushed forward, and the earth swallowed him whole as he plunged into one of the hidden pits. His scream tore through the forest like a warning. Two more charged blindly, stepping on the vine rope David had exposed. The mechanism snapped, releasing the tension that held a series of loose logs in place. They crashed down the slope with terrifying force, knocking one hunter into a tree and crushing the leg of another. Panic surged again. "Stop running!" Redding bellowed. "Get control!" But they weren't listening anymore. This forest felt haunted, cursed, alive. Every step felt like it might be their last. David moved like a phantom, never staying in one spot long enough for a clear shot. He darted between trees, using the darkness to cloak him. He struck from angles they didn't expect, knocking a torch out of a hand, snapping a branch to redirect attention, hurling a stone to mimic footsteps. Every misdirection pushed the hunters deeper into the traps. A man lunged at David with a knife, but David sidestepped, striking his elbow with the axe handle hard enough to dislocate it. The man screamed, the sound raw and desperate. David grabbed him and shoved him into a pit just as another log trap snapped shut overhead. Meanwhile, Harlan fired 2 shots, clean, precise. Each hit a hunter who had broken too close to the oak. David's heart pounded, but not with fear, with focus. He knew what came next. He crouched behind a fallen trunk and whispered, "Redding's coming. Be ready." Harlan reloaded shakily. "Man like Redding, he ain't gonna fall for no trap." "No," David agreed. "He won't." "Then how you plan to stop him?" David rose, eyes narrowed, sensing Redding's presence advancing through the trees like a storm. "I don't need to trap him." He stepped forward into a patch of moonlight. "I need to face him." Just then, Tobias Redding emerged at the far end of the clearing, his lantern held high, his expression twisted with fury, his gun drawn and aimed directly at David's chest. "There you are," Redding growled. "You've cost me 10 good men." David took one step forward. "There will be more before sunrise." Redding's eyes gleamed. "You think you're slipping away again? Not this time. I'm ending you myself." David didn't flinch. "Come into the circle, then." Redding stepped into the clearing, but he didn't come alone. Behind him at least 6 hunters remained, guns drawn, chins set with grim determination. Harlan's breath hitched. "We're outnumbered." "No," David whispered, every muscle coiling like a spring. "We're in the heart of the forest now." He raised the axe handle. "And this place remembers me." As Redding lifted his gun, David lunged into the darkness, a blur of motion, vengeance, and precision, ready for the final confrontation that would end everything. The night had finally swallowed the forest whole. Only the faint glow of dying embers from scattered fires illuminated the paths where men had dared to tread, and even those sparks seemed hesitant, as if the trees themselves had claimed dominion over the land. David moved silently, fluid as shadow, feeling every root and rock beneath his feet. Each step was a careful negotiation with the dark, a pact with the forest he knew better than any man who hunted him. The remnants of Tobias Redding's men had been scattered, maimed, or gone entirely, and the echoes of their fear still lingered in the whisper of the wind through the branches. But David did not pause to feel triumph. There was no room for celebration, only movement, only survival, and only the weight of a legend that would not die. He passed over the ground where pits had swallowed men, where snapped branches bore the marks of broken limbs, and where shallow graves disguised the restless soil. His mind replayed every strike, every calculated decision, every choice that had allowed him to remain alive, while the hunters, those who had once wielded power with arrogance and cruelty, lay defeated. He had not killed indiscriminately, he had made every act count, turning the men's own brutality against them. And yet, he knew that in the eyes of the world, he had become something more than human. The whisper of his deeds had already begun spreading like wildfire through plantations, cabins, and taverns, carried on frightened lips. Men feared the shadow that moved through the south, that struck without warning, that could vanish into the night as if swallowed by the earth itself. David reached a clearing, the remnants of an old swamp that had long since dried into a maze of tangled roots and shallow pools. He paused, crouched low, feeling the rhythm of the forest pulse around him. This was a place he had known as a child, a place where the land itself offered both refuge and passage. He traced the path with his eyes, noting each depression in the earth, each hollow where water had pooled, each low-hanging branch that could conceal a man or trap a pursuer. In these woods, he was not simply a fugitive. He was a master, a hunter, a force that moved beyond the limitations of ordinary flesh. The forest bent around him, guiding him, hiding him, feeding him the knowledge that the men who chased him had long since abandoned rational thought in favor of blind terror. The legends had already begun among the enslaved. In hushed tones around smoky hearths, they whispered his deeds. They spoke of the man who had eliminated scores of white men without mercy or hesitation, of a figure whose presence was felt more than seen, whose strikes were precise and unstoppable. In cabins and behind locked doors, slaves murmured about the shadow, about the one who was no longer bound to any master, no longer answerable to any authority. Some feared him, some revered him, but all recognized the truth. He was free in a way the world could not contain, and though they did not see him, they felt the power of his presence, as if it moved silently across the south, invisible yet undeniable. David had no name that anyone would remember, no record that could tie him to the lands he traversed. He was a ghost in the very soil, a force of vengeance that the men who thought themselves unstoppable could not anticipate. Even the bounty hunters who had once boasted of their skill, the mercenaries who had laughed at the idea of tracking a single slave, now whispered his name in terror. Hollow Creek, Pike Ridge, Eagle Bend, names that had once been synonymous with oppression now carried a different weight. They were the stages of his campaign, the evidence of a strategy so precise it bordered on the supernatural. And yet, he did not linger on the accomplishments of the night. Survival demanded constant motion, and a legend once begun required careful maintenance. As he moved through the forest, David's thoughts turned to the men he had left behind, those who had been careless, arrogant, or cruel. The terror he had sown among them would linger, not because of the bodies he left, but because of what they could not see. The horror of the hunt was in the uncertainty, knowing that at any moment the shadow could appear, strike, and vanish again. He did not need to kill every man. The fear he inspired was enough to dismantle their authority, to create cracks in a society that had relied on brutality as a tool of control. Every whispered tale, every rumor of a man who eliminated hundreds and disappeared without trace, became a weapon more potent than any rifle or whip. Hours passed, the forest shifting around him as the wind whispered secrets only he could hear. David moved along old animal trails, step-ing lightly, listening intently. Every sound was a message. The rustle of leaves meant movement ahead. The cry of a nightbird indicated disturbance. The snap of a twig could signify either danger or opportunity. He had become attuned to the rhythms of the land in a way no ordinary man could, blending instinct, experience, and intuition into a singular consciousness. This awareness allowed him to navigate the forest with precision, to avoid detection, and to orchestrate the fates of those who pursued him with terrifying efficiency. In the distance, he glimpsed a faint glow, the lights of a small settlement, a plantation, a place where men still believed themselves in control. They had not yet heard his story. They had not yet seen the results of the campaign that had begun at Hollow Creek and continued across the south. He slowed, crouching low, observing. Their guards were sloppy, their confidence misplaced, their routines predictable. The perfect opportunity presented itself, not for slaughter but for demonstration. David did not need to enter openly. He could pass unseen, leaving only evidence of his presence: a toppled chair, a broken window, footprints that led nowhere, a gate swinging on its hinges, enough to remind the people within that the shadow had passed through, and that no man, no patrol, no guard could contain him. He moved carefully, each step calculated to avoid the notice of the watchers on the periphery. A branch snapped lightly underfoot, but even that served a purpose, drawing attention in a controlled manner. A dog barked in the distance, then fell silent. Men called to each other, lights swung, torches waved, but David was already gone, merging with the darkness as if he had never existed. The psychological impact was far greater than any physical confrontation. Fear, uncertainty, and legend coalesced into a force that no army, no posse, no bounty hunter could combat. By the time they realized he had been there, he was already gone, leaving only questions, terror, and a growing reputation that bordered on myth. He moved on deeper into the forest to another set of abandoned ruins, remnants of plantations long since destroyed or left behind. Here he paused, crouching among the broken walls, listening. The wind carried voices, faint and trembling, men speaking of disappearances, of bodies never found, of a shadow that could not be tracked. Slaves whispered of a man who moved like smoke, who struck without hesitation, who disappeared like mist. Even their fear carried hope, hope that one who had been oppressed could wield power in ways their masters could not comprehend. David understood that he had become more than a man. He was a symbol, a force, a warning and a promise rolled into one. Days passed as he continued his movement through the south, leaving behind traces that could not be followed, yet shaping the land and the people who inhabited it. Hunters, bounty hunters, and overseers became obsessed, paranoid, cautious. They spoke of his deeds in hushed tones, passed warnings among themselves, and altered their behavior based on rumor and fear. Yet he remained untraceable, invisible, unstoppable. He was everywhere and nowhere. The forest, the swamps, the rivers, they were all allies, forming a network that he navigated with effortless mastery. Each encounter, each movement reinforced the legend, and each tale added another layer of fear, awe, and speculation. Eventually, the forest began to thin. David moved along the edge of a river, the water flowing steadily and carrying with it the sounds of civilization, the faint hum of a distant town, the clatter of wagons, the occasional shout of laborers. He stayed hidden, letting the current mask his presence, letting the terrain obscure his path. In the nights that followed, he observed towns and settlements, leaving subtle messages, marks carved into trees, symbols etched into the earth, signals only those attuned could understand. Slaves in those areas eager to notice, to whisper, to hope. They spoke of a man who could not be caught, who moved unseen, who struck with precision. To them, he was not simply a threat, he was a promise that justice, however dark and uncompromising, could exist in a world that had known only oppression. Time passed. Months. Perhaps years. David continued his existence in silence, unbound by the constraints of name, ownership, or expectation. The white men who had once pursued him either disappeared, fled, or remained haunted by the fear he had sown. Communities whispered of his presence as a cautionary tale, a ghost story, a legend with teeth and claws. Yet he never lingered. He never returned to claim trophies or recognition. He existed solely as a force, a shadow moving through the lands of the South, a living enigma whose story would be told long after his footsteps had faded. Eventually, he vanished completely. Not captured, not witnessed leaving, simply gone from the world as it knew him. Some claimed he had fled north, crossing into lands where slavery could not follow. Others believed he had escaped to the Caribbean, to Haiti or beyond, where he might continue to live under a new identity. Still others whispered that he had become one with the forest, a spirit of vengeance, a guardian in shadow form, watching the lands he had traversed and the people he had left behind. Whatever the truth, his legend persisted. Slaves told stories by firelight of the nameless figure who had eliminated hundreds of oppressors and vanished without trace. They whispered his deeds to children, to strangers, to those who would remember that in a world dominated by cruelty, one man, one force, could challenge the impossible. The white men spoke of him in terror, a warning to anyone who underestimated the power of someone who had nothing left to lose. He had become more than man, more than myth. He had become an idea, a manifestation of vengeance, skill, and freedom that could not be contained, that could not be silenced, that would never be seen again. And so the shadow persisted, not as a man, not as a slave, not as a hunter, but as a force that reshaped fear and hope alike. Wherever the stories reached, they carried the message: justice could come from the darkness. The oppressed could strike, vanish, and leave the world forever changed. And in that knowledge, the legend endured, echoing through the South like the whisper of the wind through the ancient forests, unseen, unstoppable, impossible, eternal,